Welcome back to our second podcast of a series of podcasts developed for Gambling Harm Awareness 2020, funded by the Gambling Rehabilitation Fund on behalf of the South Australian Government, PsychMed and the Wellbeing Recovery Institute. Today we will be focusing on sports betting and COVID-19, and we are lucky enough to have Dr. Alex Russell, Dr. Jane Oakes and Dr. Quinton Black back again with us today. Thank you for joining us and to our listeners for tuning in. Firstly, before we get started, I'd like to do an acknowledgement to country. We would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on and pay respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. To introduce our speakers, and for those of you who missed our first podcast of the series, I'll introduce Dr. Alex Russell, Dr. Jane Oakes, and Dr. Quinton Black. Dr. Alex Russell is a senior postdoctoral fellow at Central Queensland University, Australia. He has worked in gambling research since 2011, studying various topics, including internet gambling and social media use by gambling companies, gambling-related stigma, gambling inducements, promotions, and direct messages from gambling operators, sports betting, impulse betting, gender differences, gambling in Indigenous communities, and social influences on gamblers. His other research interests include taste and smell, particularly wine, perception and synesthesia. Then we have Dr. Jane Oakes. Dr. Oakes is a program facilitator at PsychMed, the largest community-based provider of mental health and addiction services in South Australia. She has previously held multiple senior positions at addiction treatment organisations and has extensive cognitive behavioural therapy experience, and has completed her PhD on relapse in electronic gaming machine gambling. And finally, we have Dr. Quinton Black. Dr. Black is a medical practitioner, clinical psychologist, educator and researcher. He is the program director at PsychMed. Dr. Black has worked for 38 years in mental health and addiction as a counsellor, psychologist, educator and medical practitioner. He has run multiple programs for problem gamblers in South Australia since the early 1990s. He is a senior clinical lecturer in psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the University of Adelaide and a senior clinical lecturer in psychology in the School of Psychology, Society and Justice at the University of South Australia. We also have an additional speaker today, Professor Paul Del Fabro. Professor Del Fabro graduated from the University of Adelaide with degrees in arts, commerce and economics, and a PhD in psychology, specifically on gambling. He has since published extensively in the psychology of gambling and other areas with a total of 350 publications. He has been an advisor to the Federal Productivity Commission and has overseen multiple prevalence studies both in Australia and overseas. Welcome, Professor Del Fabro. To begin the podcast, we'll start with Dr. Alex Russell. Can you tell us about what changes you are seeing in sports betting these days?
Sure. So when you think about how you had to place a bet back at, before the internet, you had to get your cash out, go to a venue, it was all this very labour-intensive process. Fill in a slip and then, to go and get your winnings, you had to go back to the venue or wait there till the match was over. But these days, of course, we can bet anywhere, anytime on our mobiles. So we're seeing, that internet gambling and gambling on mobiles in particular is increasing for sports betting. And that also means that people can do it together. So you can, hang out with your mate and go and have a beer at the pub to watch the game, but you can also have your phone in your hand. And we know that, particularly young men are into sports betting and they get quite competitive with each other too. So you can, have these two blokes having a few drinks, or more than two, having a few drinks, placed a few bets, and then just seeing what else to bet on too. And then, of course, you can go next door and have a whack on the pokies too. So we're seeing this becoming more and more accessible. We're also seeing the products changing too. You used to only really bet on maybe who was going to win, maybe by how much, and we're seeing an explosion in markets that are now available. Who's going to score first? How many tackles this person's going to make in the game? Things like that. The ability to bet once the match has started is something that is, fairly concerning. And in Australia, we do have some restrictions on that. You can't bet online Once a match has started, you have to call up to place a bet. But overseas, you can place a bet in play online. So if you can open an account overseas, that's easy enough to do. Then you can bet on in play. And we're also seeing that you can bet in play on things that are just about to happen. So, who's going to win the next point in tennis? Now, it's not a huge thing in Australia. Most of the sports don't want it. But technically, it could be brought in if any of the sports want it. And there's kind of, where is the line? So in cricket, what's going to happen on the next ball versus what's going to happen in the next over. And an over only takes about sort of 3 to 5 minutes. So we know that there are those markets that are available. Now, if you see what's happening, the gap between placing the bet and the outcome of the bet being known is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, to the point where you can place bets and find out very quickly if you've won or lost, and then go and place another bet. Which means that, it's really easy to get into the zone, just like a pokey. You can place bet after bet, you can chase your losses, and we've seen, I've got a paper out from a couple of years ago that shows that the people who are getting involved in these kinds of, in-play betting and fast types of betting there are overwhelmingly already experiencing problems. So the paper I have showed that 95% of people who are betting on these things called micro bets, what's going to happen next ball, that sort of thing, are at least at risk or experiencing gambling problems. So 95%, right? It's this sort of thing. So we're seeing that, sports betting is becoming more accessible, and the new products that are coming through are becoming a bit more dangerous. So that's a bit of a concern to us.
Thank you, Dr. Russell. It really sounds like we've lost that buffer between placing the bet and finding out the outcome, which is increasing the harms. And 95% is certainly quite a shocking statistic as well. Could you speak further about how betting in Australia is different to betting overseas?
Yeah, so in Australia we have some pretty restrictive online betting laws compared to a lot of other places. So online we can only really bet on sports and races, novelty events like, what colour tie someone's going to wear, like, the Prime Minister or whatever. Esports is a fairly new one that's come in. It's just considered as a new type of sporting event. And you can buy your lottery tickets online. And just recently you can play Keno online as well. But you can't do things like play an online pokey because Australian licensed operators aren't allowed to offer them. You can't have online roulette or poker, these things. And the argument is that a lot of those forms that are not allowed have that very fast-paced kind of betting to them. So we have that restricted, and that's also why in Australia you can't place a bet on a game once it's started online. That's why you have to make a phone call. It's about being a bit of a barrier there for a bit of safety. And we're sort of seeing that, a lot of the operators want to bring that in because it's a lucrative market, right? These are the people who spend a lot, have problems, want to spend a lot. It's a product that appeals to them. And it's a good way of extracting more money out of their wallets, essentially. Overseas, we do see that pretty much all of these products are available to people online, and that's sort of the norm for them. So online poker in America, for example, is a really big thing. Online sports betting in America, though, has only really just come back in after a Supreme Court ruling in 2018, because they had this weird relationship with betting on sports because of the Black Sox scandal back at the start of the 1900s, where there was a gambling corruption issue that happened with one of the teams there. And they basically said, you know what, that's it, no more sports betting online. But they've started to bring that back in. And being America, they're very, we have to have freedom to do everything we want. So they're bringing in all of these different forms, including the potentially harmful ones. So in a way, it's really good that Australia has some of these restrictions because they are about keeping you safe. And if it's a bit of a thing, a bit of an annoyance to not be able to bet online on a game that's in play and you have to make a phone call, I'd argue that there's still plenty of other opportunities out there, things for you to bet on anyway. And, while that might be annoying to some people who just really want to do it and can still, stay in control of their gambling, for many people we've seen that it doesn't. So we differ from overseas in that we have different restrictions on what's allowed. But I'd also point one other thing out that's really important is that online you can bet on your credit card, whereas you can't do that in venues. So, that's a bit of an issue. You can bet on your credit card. You can use money that's not yours to gamble. And it's not like a transaction, any other transaction that you do online. You don't get 55 days interest free. You get hit with a higher interest rate and it's treated as a cash advance. So you get cash advance fees too. So, need to be a bit aware of these things with online gambling. Having said that, a lot of people manage to gamble online and keep themselves, pretty harm-free, and it's a perfectly legitimate thing to be able to do. But there are reasons that we have these restrictions in place, and that gives you a bit of a snapshot of why.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Can you talk to us a little bit about what changes you see in the future of sports betting?
Yeah, so we see that there's a bunch of changes that are coming through. There's this thing called the National Consumer Protection Framework, which is being brought in, and that's bringing in a bunch of restrictions based on a whole bunch of evidence that's around the place. Some of it's ours, to put things like links with payday lenders to rest, those sorts of things. So again, trying to put restrictions on the product, because at the moment you can do a lot of things with sports betting, despite other restrictions that we have in place. Again, to keep it a bit of a safe thing. We have to remember that gambling is an addictive product, and, things are done with these products to make them more addictive because it's more lucrative to do it that way. So we do need to have certain restrictions in place. So there are certain things that are coming in there through the National Consumer Protection Framework. Most banks in Australia these days don't allow you to bet on your credit card. So I think that's going to become more universal. I've just seen, I think Bank of Australia today, just recently has announced that too. So that's about how consumers get to the product. We have seen, though, that with sports betting, a lot of operators are bringing in things to help keep people safe, setting limits on your account and self-exclusion and those things. So some kind of broader multi-operator scheme like they have in the UK that allows you to exclude from all of them, I think should hopefully be coming in. And my understanding is there's some movement potentially happening there. But I think in terms of the actual product itself, I think we're going to see operators becoming more and more inventive. They're very good at coming up with really interesting markets to bet on. And let's face it, their advertising is, you might not like seeing gambling ads everywhere, but it's pretty good marketing, right? It catches your attention, it gets you talking about it. And, they're very good at those things. So I think that we're going to see them coming out with some, really interesting new products all the time to find new ways to keep people interested and new ways of marketing as well, particularly as under the National Consumer Protection Framework, some of their avenues of marketing are changing. So I think we're going to see differences in the way that the product is accessed, differences in the way it's marketed, and differences in the actual products that are put through as well.
Sounds like as we try and put things in place to reduce those harms, the operators and things like that are going to sort of change up their game and be a little bit more clever, which makes things tough. You've touched on esports a little bit. Do you see this as being a big market, or could you talk a little bit about esports?
Yeah, so esports are professional video game competitions. So, people get very good at playing first-person shooter games or team games and play together against other people. And this has become something where there's actually a huge market there. The best players in the world make millions a year, which is sort of surprising because, when I was a kid, Mum basically said, if you play video games, you're never going to make a living. But sure enough, these people are, right? And they're also being sponsored by some of the biggest sports stars. So a lot of, the biggest basketball stars in the world have skin in the game. They're putting money into these esports competitions. And of course, massive lucrative sponsorships and things like that. And gambling is a big part of it too. So a lot of the best teams, they have team shirts, just like any other sporting contest, will have, a gambling company on there to, make that link. And so sure enough, you can bet on who's going to win. And these are just like any other sporting event now. They pack out big stadiums, they're streamed online, and betting odds are offered. Now, Australian operators, my take on it anyway, is that they're kind of just dipping their toe in the water. They're offering, which team or players are going to win, but that's sort of about it. Like all of these fancy sports betting markets that they've come out with, like who's going to score first, you could potentially have in these esports games, like, who's going to kill the other person first because they killed each other multiple times in the game, for example. But I haven't seen so much of that with Australian operators. Whereas that is coming overseas. There are one or two specialised Australian esports operators that have that point of difference. They understand it more, and they offer more markets there. But there are also overseas operators that really specialise in esports and might do a bit of sports and race betting on the side, maybe. But esports is what they do, and so It's been interesting to me that the Australian operators that are normally so good at keeping on top of new products and things like that have trod very carefully in terms of esports, because it just seems like they don't quite understand it, or they're a bit wary about putting too much into it just yet. So that tells me that the Australian market is not very big yet, but what we're seeing overseas is that it's a huge market. We're going to see this grow because it's younger people coming through. So older people who bet on sports and racing and, novelty events and things like that, they've all pretty much said, you know what, I don't get video games. I don't want to know about this. It's not something I'm willing to invest time in, because a lot of the people who do get into betting want to know their product. They want to know, do research on which teams are playing well or how that horse ran last time it ran. And they're not willing to learn a whole new product, esports, that they just know nothing about. But these games appeal to younger people. So we're going to see, I think, as these younger people become 18, and have more easy access to it, certainly some are betting underage, but as they get the ability to access these products legally, I think we're going to see esports taking off. But I think we're going to be slow until the operators kind of work out, some more of the markets that can be offered there.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear a little bit about esports. And I think it's a perfect segue to move over to Dr. Jane Oakes, who might be able to tell us a little bit about youth and adolescent gambling.
Youth gambling can happen anywhere and any time, particularly as both sports and race betting can be done online. And teenagers may be able to get around age restrictions when placing bets online, and can also register fake accounts and use their parents' credit cards to gamble. It is important to consider that these adolescents are particularly vulnerable to the harmful effects of gambling because their ability to assess risk is still developing. So the most popular forms that these adolescents are gambling on these days are lotteries, scratch tickets, race and sports betting, and private card games in their own homes. Latest research from a longitudinal study of approximately 3,000 Australian children found that 1 in 5 boys and 1 in 8 girls aged 16 to 17 years of age spent money on at least one gambling activity in the last 12 months. And despite the illegal age restrictions around gambling, 1 in 25 youth were found to have some problems with their gambling. And factors that are associated with a greater risk of these adolescents developing problem gambling behaviours included having a friend who had a problem with gambling, having low self-esteem, displaying a positive attitude towards gambling and that their parents also gambled, having peers who gambled, and access to gambling services and products. Also, males were more at risk of gambling, and those that were impulsive and lacked self-discipline and were more likely to engage in risky behaviours. It has been suggested that youth gambled for the potential to win money, for the competition, and using gambling as a way of fulfilling their psychological needs, such as coping with adversity, escape from daily stresses such as bullying at school, or to reduce anxiety and depression. Often these youth talk about being able to zone out while they're gambling, and it gives them an escape from feeling these negative emotions. And when adolescents do develop gambling problems, it can be associated with a wide range of social, economic, personal, mental health and physical problems, including missed school and crime. Interestingly, what we are seeing is that despite adolescents having objective knowledge of mathematics and statistics, this does not protect them from having an interest in gambling. Therefore, one important strategy is to help these young people engage in school activities that help provide them insights into their beliefs about gambling and ways to address their overall physical and mental health well-being. So in my clinical role, I've helped many parents who have come for support with the realisation that their adolescent has been gambling considerable amounts of money. And working with these adolescents, many are open to understanding why they were finding it difficult to control their gambling, and by using evidence-based treatments and providing psychoeducation, These youth can recover from gambling and then refocus on their career goals and their own mental and physical health, such as re-engaging with sports and friendship groups outside of gambling.
Thank you, Dr. Oakes, for giving us such a great overview of the prevalence and key issues to do with youth gambling. Dr. Russell, did you have anything to add to that?
I think one of the other things we're concerned about with adolescents at the moment is not necessarily the gambling side of things. Like, you know, we are concerned about that. We're concerned about the amount of ads that are on TV and how that normalises gambling amongst young people and those sorts of things. But we're also seeing that there are a lot of gambling-like activities popping up in other places. So some of these are things that simulate gambling. So, you know, on your mobile phone or on your game console, you can download apps that are essentially poker machines. And you can't win any money out of them, you know, or poker or roulette or anything. You know, they're all there available in apps. But you can essentially put money into them to unlock levels, but you can never win any money. And so because you can't win money, it's not technically or legally classified as gambling. And that means that it's available to people who are under 18. So they can access, you know, gambling mechanics and learn how a pokey works or how the roulette table works. And the other side of it is because they're not classified as gambling, they're not restricted like gambling are. Like there are rules around pokies. They have to have a 90% return to player percentage, right? Or thereabouts. Whereas with these online ones or on your phones, you can play and win money in them and they never have to care about that because they don't have to pay you out. So you could develop this understanding or this feeling that you're good at the pokies because, hey, I'm playing this one on my phone for free or just putting a little bit of money in here or there to unlock the next level. And sure, I can't win any money, but it looks like I'm good at it. So maybe I'll go and try a real one. Because what have I got to lose? Maybe there's just something special about me. So it can feed into some of those issues too. But the other side is we're seeing gambling-like products popping up elsewhere too, often in and around video games. So things like loot boxes. Now, loot boxes are a really tricky one. What they are, you know, with video games, you used to buy a game up front. You'd pay the $20 or the $50 or the $100 if it was a really good game to get the latest game, and that would be the only cost. Over time, that's kind of morphed into now you might even start the game for free, but you might reach a certain point where you can't pass it unless you pay, or you go very slow in the game unless you pay to speed things up a bit, you know, like to open treasure chests quicker or something along those lines. So what loot boxes are is a way to make money in the game. So what loot boxes are is a way for game developers to make money from you in an ongoing way. So they might give you the game for free, or they might still charge you a bit for the game up front. But then they release these things in the game called loot boxes, and you can either earn them from playing the game over a period of time, or you can buy them. And often in some games, the ones that you buy are a bit better or objectively better, you know, to make you pay rather than just try to keep playing for them. And you don't know what you're going to get in the box until you open it. So you're spending $5 to get something that may or may not be worth something in the game. Now, the things that you get in loot boxes are usually things called skins, which are things that make your characters in your game, you know, look a bit different. And some of them are quite rare. So, you know, if you've got a particular skin, it means that you must play the game a bit or, you know, pay for certain things. And there's a degree of prestige with that. Now, not only that, in some games, the skins that you get, you can actually sell them to people outside of the game, so they have value. Or there are even gambling websites that have popped up that will use skins as currency, so you can use them for gambling. And, you know, there's not much in the way of age verification with a lot of these sites either. They're all offshore. They're all, you know, things that shouldn't be offering their products to Australians. And so, you know, we can sort of see there's an easy path into those gambling websites there. But just take a step back and think about what the loot box itself is. You can put money in, you don't know what you're going to get, and what you get could be worth some money. And that sounds very much like gambling, right? Money in, degree of chance over what you get, and money out. To the point where overseas, like Belgium and the Netherlands, for example, they have restricted them. Whereas here, they're freely available to people under 18. So even though they're not, like, it's not completely obvious that they're a gambling product, right? But they have all those sorts of mechanisms in them, like those gambling-like mechanisms. And in Australia, they're not restricted. So they're freely available to people under 18. And that's one of the concerns that we're sort of seeing here, is that it's not just products that look and feel like gambling, like, you know, those pokey apps and things, but also that gambling kind of mechanic, you know, put something at risk, don't know if you're going to get something of value. I didn't this time, maybe I'll just try again. That sort of thing is starting to come through a lot for younger people. It's similar to things like footy trading cards though, really, isn't it? So that's kind of always been with us, but now it's kind of in these places where young people hang out a lot. And in particular, you know, these are places where they socialise too, because they're very social environments. You can talk online. And if you're good at these games, it gives you a degree of status too amongst your peers. So we're sort of seeing these things, you know, these simulated gambling activities or activities that look and feel a lot like gambling or have those mechanics as potentially the new frontier here to get younger people interested into that kind of thing. And that's one of the things we're quite concerned about.
Thank you, Dr. Russell. That's quite scary. I think it sounds like young people and young children even are kind of being hooked in to these types of games. And I think, as you and Dr. Oakes mentioned, with young people, their brains still developing, they're a lot more vulnerable to this type of influence. Dr. Oakes, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I think you know, it's just highlighting that these young children that are gambling really aren't able to comprehend the value of money, the risks that they're taking. They can't make calculated risks, and certainly a lot of it's going unmonitored, where parents aren't really aware what their children are doing, because, as we said, it's really hidden. It's hidden away.
Professor Del Fabro, could you perhaps give us an overview of some of the changes that are occurring within the gambling industry and the impact and growth of sports betting as a mode of gambling, and the type of people that are being targeted or are engaging in this type of modality?
Yeah, the gambling industry at the moment is an interesting one, because I guess 10, 20 years ago, people were talking about, you know, the increasing growth in slot machines and those sorts of things. And instead, what's happened over the last few years is that we've seen a return of traditional forms of gambling, but in a more electronic, much more interactive and accessible form. And one of the most common of these we've seen, particularly in Australia, is sports betting. Now, sports betting has probably received most publicity because of the saturation advertising we've seen on TV and sports broadcasts. And so the public and the media and politicians in general have talked a lot about sports betting simply because of advertising. It's seen as being so accessible in appropriately rated programs. And so sports betting has come to be one of the most commonly talked about topics in Australia. In terms of growth, sports betting has doubled probably in the last 20 years. Whereas most other forms of gambling, including, you know, gambling on slot machines or pokies, has declined consistently over the last 20 years. So sports betting is definitely one of the major growth areas. It's also changed in its nature. Sports betting used to be a much more intermittent form of gambling. You'd gamble occasionally on events such as the cricket or the football. But now, because you've got the internet, you've got the ability to play on multiple matches, different types of bets, exotic bets, micro bets. So it's become much more of a continuous form of activity which can engage people anywhere, anytime, whereas it used to be much more about going to a sports event or hanging out for a particular sports event on which to place a bet. So sports betting has the potential to continue to become one of the major growth areas. Around about 8 to 10% of the population gambles at least once per year on sports betting, but it attracts a different type of person from slot machines. It typically attracts people who've got a little bit more disposable income. People are often younger, male, more educated. The difference is that sports betting is a form of gambling where there are no upper limits usually on the stakes which you can place. And so while I don't have the continuity and that sort of mesmerising quality you see in slot machines, which often lead people to being trapped in venues playing for many hours, It's a form of gambling where people can very quickly place very large bets. So there's been many cases of people spending tens of thousands of dollars very quickly in binges because they think they've got a particular winner or a particular strategy for winning. I guess the problems with sports betting for therapists is that it is a skill-based form of gambling. You can't say that this is all luck and chance and that there's nothing you can do to win. There are, in fact, strategies for winning on sports, and there are professional sports bettors who use arbitrage and various methods. So it's a challenge, I think, for therapists to work out ways to convey to people this is a potentially dangerous form of gambling in excess, because you can spend very large amounts of money. And a bit like professional poker players, a lot of people can do it, but only a very small number of people actually make a living from it, which is a bit like racing as well. And so the fact that the industry continues to make a profit is an indicator that not that many people really make a lot of serious money from this. And so sports betting, I think, will be very much on the radar for the next few years, but different in the sense that the sorts of person you'll have coming through the door are going to be different from a typical pokie player.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. One of the things I would observe is that when I recall opening the first gambling treatment program in the South Australian Mental Health Service prior to the introduction of electronic gaming machines, the sort of patients that I would typically see would be 45 to 55-year-old males who had an expanding girth and were suffering from depression and often frequent the many TABs that used to be around at that time, and they were very much committed to the horse racing and trots and these sorts of betting modalities. With the introduction of electronic gaming machines, we saw a really rapid change in the breadth of the demographics that were coming in for treatment and assistance. Do you think with sports betting, is there a typical profile? And it seems that some of the sports bars that have been growing in numbers seem to be targeting young males, as we mentioned earlier. What does the research sort of tell us about that at this stage?
Yeah, the typical sports bettor is similar to the typical online gambler, and also the people who are more likely to gamble on table games at casinos. It's much more likely to be male. So whereas you might see more of a 50-50 or 60-40 split in favour of males on poker machines, often it can be just 50-50. It's equally popular with women. With sports betting and casino games, it's often more like 70-30, 80-20. It's much more likely to be males. It's much more likely to be people in the younger middle-aged to younger age groups, and much more likely to be people who've got high disposable incomes and often higher levels of education. It's much more likely to be people who are single, who've got disposable incomes, not necessarily a lot of commitments yet, but who are very active on social media, active on their smartphones to place bets. The sorts of young people who follow a lot of sport as well. One of the correlates of a lot of sports betting is being engaged with sports and watching lots of sports. I think it's very much the case that betting has become very normalised in sport, and it's almost seen as part and parcel of the game. Given the quality of current AFL play, some would say that maybe that's needed to make something more interesting to watch than what we're currently seeing. But certainly it's a case that with most major sports, betting is now seen as an integral part of the experience of watching the sport. So therefore, the more you watch it, the more likely you are to bet on it.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think some of the clients that we often see coming in are athletes from AFL and NRL and things into our program. So, yes, you can see that point that people who are engaged often end up engaging in gambling on those sports as well too, which I should point out is not really legal in most codes. Thanks very much for that.
Well, this brings us to the end of our second podcast on sports betting. Thank you so much to our speakers, Dr. Alex Russell, Dr. Jane Oakes, Professor Del Fabro and Dr. Black. It's been great to hear a bit about sports betting. And thank you again to our listeners for tuning into our second podcast. Our third podcast will discuss current issues to do with internet gaming disorder. So if you're interested in hearing more and learning more about internet gaming disorder, tune back in.